Trapped in a cage, he had never seen sunlight, only darkness, fear, and suffering. But when he was finally freed, his nightmare wasn't over. What if rescue came too late? The stench of rot and despair filled the air. Inside the rusted cage, a pair of deep brown eyes, once bright with curiosity, had dulled with exhaustion. The German shepherd had never known kindness, never felt a gentle touch, never heard a voice filled with warmth. His world was a concrete floor slick with filth, the iron bars that caged him, and the chorus of whimpers from dozens of others like him. For as long as he could remember, the walls of the puppy mill had been his entire world. The humans who walked through the aisles were faceless shadows, their voices sharp, their hands rough. The shepherd had no name, only a number branded onto a filthy tag clipped to his ear. His body bore the marks of his life, ribs pressing against his matted coat, sores on his paws from standing in filth, and eyes that had seen too much suffering. The others around him were just as broken. Some had stopped hoping entirely, their bodies unmoving, their spirits shattered. Others paced in endless, maddening circles, their minds unraveling from confinement. And then there were the puppies, the ones who hadn't yet learned that the world was cruel. They still whined for their mothers, still scrambled toward any movement, still believed in rescue. But the shepherd knew better. No one came. No one ever came. Until that day. The first sign of something different was the barking. Not the usual cries of hunger and fear, but something sharper, panic, urgency. Then came the pounding on doors, the heavy boots of strangers running down the aisles, and finally, the cages opened. A woman knelt before his enclosure. She smelled different from the others. No stench of neglect, no bitter scent of greed, just warmth. Her hands, though gloved, trembled as she reached toward him. "You're okay now," she murmured. "We're taking you home." Home. The word meant nothing to him. The shepherd didn't move. He had learned long ago that movement led to pain. He braced for the rough grip, for the snap of a leash around his neck, for another nightmare. But the woman didn't yank him forward. She waited. "It's okay, buddy," she whispered. "You're safe now." Safe. Another word without meaning. It wasn't until she unlatched the door, until the metal swung open with a groan, that the shepherd finally stepped forward. His legs wobbled from disuse, his body tensed for the impact of a blow that never came. Instead, gentle arms wrapped around him, lifting him from the darkness. He flinched, but didn't resist. He was too weak, too tired. His head rested against her chest as she carried him out into the light. For the first time, the shepherd saw the sky. It was too bright, too vast, and it terrified him. His world had always been small, confined. He had never known such openness. The air smelled different too, fresher, cleaner, but it only made the weight of filth on his fur more unbearable. "He's in worse shape than the others," a voice said. A man this time, speaking in hushed tones. "He might not make it." The shepherd closed his eyes. He had survived so much. Surely he could survive this too. And the next days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and unfamiliar sensations. He was bathed, his tangled fur stripped of the filth of years, revealing the scars underneath. He was given food, real food, not the moldy scraps that had barely kept him alive. He was touched, but not with cruelty. These hands were soft, patient, careful not to startle him. The woman was always there. Her name, he learned, was Erin. She spoke to him constantly, even when he didn't understand. "You're safe now," she would say. "You're a fighter, you know that?" She called him Bruno, a name that meant nothing at first, but the way she said it made his ears twitch. Erin's home was quiet, unlike the puppy mill where the cries of the suffering never ceased. Here, the air smelled of wood and warmth. The floors were soft under his paws. The light wasn't harsh, but golden, spilling through large windows. But even as his body healed, his mind remained trapped in the past. Bruno couldn't sleep without nightmares. In his dreams, he was still in the cage. He still smelled the rot, still felt the cold iron press against his skin. When he woke, he would tremble, waiting for the pain that always followed. But Erin was always there, her hand resting gently on his head. "You're safe," she would murmur, her voice steady, her presence unwavering. And yet, no matter how much kindness she showed, some part of him couldn't believe it. How could he? He had spent too long learning that humans were cruel, that hope was dangerous. Then came the collar. The sight of it sent him into a frenzy. He had worn one before, the thick leather strap that dug into his skin, the metal chain that yanked him to the ground. It had meant suffering, imprisonment. But Erin's hands were steady. "It's just a collar, Bruno," she said softly. "Just to keep you safe." Safe. Bruno didn't fight when she fastened it around his neck, but the memories surged like a flood. He bolted. He ran blindly, crashing into furniture, his heart slamming against his ribs. When Erin finally caught him, she didn't yell. She didn't punish him. She simply held him. "I'm sorry, buddy," she whispered. "I know you're scared." And for the first time, Bruno let himself lean into her. The weeks passed. The nightmares still came, but they weren't as strong. The collar still felt foreign, but Erin never used it to hurt him. He had a bed now, a real one, soft and warm. He had food every day and fresh water that didn't taste like rust. Most of all, he had Erin. And yet, there were things he couldn't shake. Every time a door slammed, he flinched. Every time a man raised his voice, his body braced for a blow. The past was still there, lurking in the corners of his mind. But then came the first wag of his tail. It happened on a morning like any other. Erin had dropped a piece of toast on the floor, and Bruno had sniffed it cautiously. When he looked up, she was smiling. "That one's yours, bud." Something in her expression, in her voice, made his tail twitch ever so slightly. Erin's eyes widened, and her smile grew. "Was that a wag?" she whispered, as if afraid to break the moment. Bruno didn't understand why she looked so happy. But when she scratched behind his ears and murmured, "Good boy," something deep inside him warmed. For the first time, hope didn't feel dangerous. But just when he began to believe in his new life, his past came back to haunt him. Because the men who had locked him away had never stopped watching. And they wanted him back. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a car. Bruno noticed it before Erin did. It had been parked across the street for 2 days now, its dark windows concealing whoever was inside. The shepherd didn't understand cars, not really, but something about this one felt wrong. The unease curled in his stomach like a sickness. A memory clawed its way back, of men moving through the rows of cages, picking out the weakest, the sickest, the ones that never came back. He had never forgotten the way their boots had sounded, the way they had smelled, like oil and sweat and something sour underneath. And now, that same smell drifted on the wind. Bruno didn't realize he was growling until Erin touched his head. "What's wrong, bud?" she asked, frowning as she followed his gaze. The car sat motionless, its engine silent, its presence heavy in the air. Erin hesitated before shaking her head. Probably just a neighbor's visitor. But Bruno knew better. That night, the nightmares returned with a vengeance. He dreamed of cages slamming shut, of hands grabbing him, of metal biting into his neck. When he woke, panting, the darkness of Erin's home felt too much like the puppy mill. He pushed himself up, his heart pounding. His body ached from sleeping on a real bed, something too soft, too unfamiliar. He needed to move, needed to know he was still free. Padding silently to the window, Bruno peered outside. The car was still there. The air felt heavier now, suffocating. His ears twitched, straining to hear beyond the wind. And then, there it was, the faintest sound. The creak of a car door opening. A shadow moved across the street. Bruno's body stiffened. He didn't think. He lunged. His paws scraped against the hardwood as he bounded toward Erin's room, barking wildly. The noise jolted her awake. "Bruno? What?" A knock at the door. It was soft. Too soft. A careful kind of knock, the kind that didn't want to wake the neighbors. Erin's face paled. She glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. Her eyes flickered to the door, then to Bruno, who stood rigid, his entire body tensed like a bowstring. Another knock. She swallowed hard, climbing out of bed. "Stay," she whispered to Bruno as she moved toward the door. Bruno didn't listen. He pressed himself against her side, his breath heavy, his hackles raised. The peephole revealed nothing but darkness. Erin hesitated, fingers hovering over the lock. Then a voice drifted through the wood. "Miss Parker?" She stiffened. They knew her name. Bruno snarled. "Who is it?" Erin's voice was steady, but Bruno could hear the tremor beneath it. A pause. Then, "Animal control. We received a report about an unlicensed dog." Silence stretched between them. Erin's grip tightened on the doorframe. "That's funny," she said, "because I registered him last week." Another pause. Then the voice turned sharper, colder. "We need to see the paperwork." Bruno's growl deepened. Something about the voice, about the smell wafting in from outside. It was all wrong. Erin wasn't stupid. She didn't open the door. "I'll call the shelter in the morning," she said. "If there's an issue, we can handle it then." Silence. Then the sound of retreating footsteps. A car door slamming. The low growl of an engine starting. Erin exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to her forehead. Bruno didn't move. She peered out the window, watching as the car rolled down the street, vanishing into the night. For the first time in weeks, she felt the cold grip of fear slide down her spine. Bruno wasn't just any rescue. Someone wanted him back. The next morning, Erin called the shelter. No one from animal control had been dispatched to her address. Her hands trembled as she ended the call. She wasn't imagining things. Bruno had been right. And if they had come once, they would come again. Erin doubled down on security. She changed the locks, installed cameras, even started sleeping with her phone clutched in her palm. But none of it eased the feeling that she was being watched. Bruno felt it too. He had begun pacing more, his body always tense, his ears constantly flicking toward sounds Erin couldn't hear. The car came back. Sometimes it stayed for hours. Other times it was gone in minutes. They were waiting, watching. And then one evening, the watching stopped. The attack came instead. It happened fast, too fast. One moment, Erin was outside, letting Bruno stretch his legs in the backyard. The next, the fence exploded inward. A figure in dark clothing lunged toward them. Bruno reacted first. The instant the man stepped forward, Bruno was airborne. His body, once frail and weak, now carried the strength of something that had survived hell. His jaws snapped around the intruder's wrist, crushing down hard enough to draw a scream. The man reeled back, cursing, his other hand swinging wildly. Something metallic glinted in the dim light. A baton. It struck Bruno across the ribs. Pain exploded through his side, but he didn't let go. He had spent years being powerless. That ended now. He twisted, dragging the man down, his teeth searching for a better grip. The man screamed again, jerking backward. "Get the hell off me!" Then Erin was there, a bat in her hands. She swung. The crack of wood against bone filled the night. The man collapsed with a strangled noise. Breathing hard, Erin staggered backward, gripping the bat like a lifeline. Bruno stood over the intruder, his body heaving. Blood dripped from his muzzle, but his eyes burned with something terrifyingly human. Rage. Erin reached for her phone with shaking fingers. The man groaned, trying to push himself up. Bruno growled, a deep, guttural sound that made Aaron's blood run cold. He wasn't letting him go. Not this time. The police arrived 10 minutes later. The man was cuffed, dragged to his feet. He refused to speak. But his phone, confiscated and unlocked, spoke for him. Dozens of messages, instructions, get the dog back. Alive if possible. If not, dispose of him. A cold weight settled in Aaron's stomach. This wasn't just about an unlicensed pet. This was something bigger. And Bruno was at the heart of it. But why? As the officers loaded the man into the squad car, Aaron looked down at Bruno. His body trembled from exhaustion, but his eyes remained sharp, locked onto the man as he disappeared into the night. For the first time, Aaron saw him for what he truly was. Not just a rescue, not just a survivor, but a warrior. And the fight wasn't over yet. Because whoever wanted him back was still out there. Waiting. The attack changed everything. Aaron had known something was wrong, but she hadn't expected it to escalate so fast. The police had assured her the intruder was in custody, but the messages on his phone told a different story. There were others. Bruno sensed it too. His body was still healing from the blow, but he refused to rest. He barely ate. He barely slept. Instead, he watched. He patrolled the house like a soldier, his ears always pricked, his nose constantly twitching. Aaron tried to reassure him, tried to reassure herself, but the truth sat in her chest like a stone. This wasn't over. Days passed in uneasy silence. Then, the car returned. Bruno saw it before Aaron did. He was outside in the yard, his nose buried in the grass, when the scent hit him. That same sour, oily stench. His head snapped up. The car was parked down the street this time, further away, trying to blend in. But Bruno knew. A growl rumbled in his chest. His fur bristled. His body tensed, ready to charge. But Aaron's voice called him back. "Bruno?" She followed his gaze. The car didn't move. Aaron's fingers curled into fists. She had spent weeks living in fear. Locking her doors. Checking the cameras. Jumping at shadows. No more. She reached for her phone, but before she could dial, the car engine rumbled to life and the vehicle sped away. Cowards. That night, Aaron made a decision. She wasn't going to wait for another attack. She needed answers. Bruno had come from a place of nightmares, but where? The shelter had taken him from the puppy mill, but the location had been kept quiet due to ongoing investigations. Aaron had been grateful for that at first. She had wanted to leave Bruno's past buried. But now, that past was clawing its way back, and she needed to know why. So she made the call. The shelter volunteer on the other end hesitated. "Miss Parker, I understand your concern, but the case is still under investigation. We can't disclose—" "I was attacked," Aaron interrupted. "In my own home. Someone wants him back." A pause. Then a sigh. "Meet me tomorrow," the volunteer said. "I'll tell you what I can." The drive was long, winding into the rural outskirts where the land stretched barren and lonely. Bruno rode in the back seat, his body tense, his eyes flicking between the trees and fields passing by. He knew. He could feel it. This place was familiar. The shelter sat on the edge of town, a small, worn-down building that smelled of disinfectant and dog fur. Aaron parked, but before she could open the door, Bruno pushed against her. She turned to him, startled. His breath came fast, his chest heaving. "It's okay," she murmured, placing a hand on his head. "You're safe." The words felt empty. They stepped inside. The volunteer, a woman in her 60s with tired eyes, led Aaron to the back office. "His case was different," she began. "Most of the dogs from that mill, They were just used for breeding. But him? She nodded at Bruno. He wasn't just any dog. He was trained. Erin's stomach twisted. Trained for what? The woman hesitated. Fighting. The air left Erin's lungs. She looked at Bruno, who sat silently at her feet, his ears pulled back, his body tense. Fighting. She had seen the scars. The hesitation whenever someone raised a hand too quickly. The way he flinched at loud voices. She thought it had been from abuse. But it was more than that. So, what? They wanted him to be a fight dog? The woman shook her head. Number. They wanted him to be a killer. Erin froze. The words echoed in her mind, sharp and cruel. A killer. Her sweet, broken, gentle Bruno. It didn't make sense. He failed, the woman continued. Wouldn't bite the other dogs, wouldn't obey. They starved him, beat him, tried to break him, but he wouldn't turn. Erin's eyes burned. They were going to kill him, the woman said. Until we got there first. Erin swallowed hard. That was why they wanted him back. Not because he was a pet. Not because he was special. Because he was evidence. Bruno had survived something he was never meant to survive. And now, they were trying to erase him. The drive home felt longer. Bruno lay curled in the back seat, his head resting against the door. Erin kept glancing at him in the mirror, her mind spinning. What had he seen? What had he endured? And more importantly, how much danger were they really in? That night, Erin didn't sleep. She sat on the couch, Bruno beside her, her laptop open. She searched for news, reports, anything. And then she found it. A raid. A puppy mill shut down. Arrests made. But one man had escaped. His name was Carter Hayes, a known breeder of illegal fight dogs, still at large. Erin's stomach twisted. She clicked through photos. And then she saw him. The man who had broken into her home. The one Bruno had taken down. Hayes's right-hand man. A chill crawled down her spine. This wasn't random. This wasn't over. They weren't just after Bruno. They were coming for him. 2 nights later, the final attack came. Bruno woke first. The scent hit him like a shockwave. Oily, sharp, wrong. He lunged to his feet, barking. Erin jolted awake. Then, a crash, glass shattering. Men. They were inside. Bruno launched forward, snarling, his body colliding with the first intruder before Erin could even react. The man hit the ground hard, screaming. Bruno didn't let go. Pain exploded through his ribs as another figure kicked him aside. He hit the wall but scrambled up, blood dripping from his muzzle. Erin was screaming. A gun. Bruno saw the metal flash. He moved, fast. His jaws clamped down on flesh. The gun fired, a deafening crack. Then, silence, heavy breathing, groaning. The men were down. Sirens wailed in the distance. Erin was shaking. Bruno. Bruno was still standing. His body trembled, blood matted his fur. His chest heaved with exhaustion. But he had won. They had won. The arrests came quickly. Carter Hayes was found 2 miles away, bleeding from a gunshot wound. Bruno's teeth had left a permanent mark on him. The evidence was undeniable. The fight ring was exposed. Bruno's past, his suffering, was no longer buried, and neither was his strength. A week later, Erin sat on the porch, Bruno at her feet. The wounds were healing, but something deeper had changed. Bruno wasn't just a rescue anymore. He was a survivor, a protector, a warrior. Erin ran her fingers through his fur. "You saved me," she whispered. Bruno nudged her hand, and for the first time, his tail wagged. A small movement, barely there. But it was enough, because he wasn't just waiting for the past to catch him anymore. He was living again, and this time, no one was taking him away. Not ever. The news spread fast. Within hours of Carter Hayes' arrest, the truth about his operation flooded the media. Reports exposed years of cruelty, the underground fight rings, the dogs who had suffered in silence. But the real story, the one that captured hearts, was Bruno, the rescue dog who had saved his owner, the survivor who had refused to break. Photographs of him, bloodied but standing, circulated everywhere. Aaron's phone never stopped ringing. Journalists wanted interviews. Shelters wanted statements. People wanted to meet Bruno, to tell his story. But Aaron ignored them all, because while the world saw a hero, she saw a dog who had been pushed to the edge, and she was terrified that, this time, the edge had finally swallowed him whole. Bruno had not wagged his tail since the night of the attack. He moved through the house like a ghost, silent, alert, always watching. He no longer paced. He no longer flinched at loud noises. But it wasn't because he wasn't afraid. It was because he was ready. His body, once tense with uncertainty, was now coiled with purpose. His eyes, once soft with trust, were now sharp with knowledge. Bruno had spent his life waiting, waiting to be hurt, waiting to be taken, waiting to be used. Now he was waiting for something else. The next threat, the next fight, and Aaron could see it killing him. Every night, she watched as he curled up by the front door, refusing to rest, his ears twitching at every sound. He barely slept, barely ate. His ribs no longer showed, but the weight he had gained was all muscle, coiled and ready to react at a moment's notice. She tried to comfort him. She sat beside him, running gentle fingers through his fur, whispering, "It's over now, Bruno. You don't have to fight anymore." But he didn't believe her. And maybe neither did she. The vet confirmed what she already knew. "He's in perfect physical health," the doctor said, running a hand gently over Bruno's back. "But mentally?" She sighed. "He's still in survival mode." Aaron swallowed hard. "What do I do?" The vet hesitated. "He needs time, and he needs to learn that the fight is over." But was it? Even with Hayes in custody, Aaron couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Because fear like this, the kind that had lived inside Bruno for years, didn't just disappear. And neither did monsters like Carter Hayes. Aaron tightened her grip on the leash as she and Bruno left the clinic. He walked beside her, head high, ears flicking back at every car that passed. The moment they stepped into the house, he went straight to his spot by the door, curled up, and resumed his silent watch. Aaron's chest ached. He had saved her, given everything to protect her. Now it was her turn to save him. 2 weeks passed. Bruno healed, physically at least. His ribs no longer ached. The bruises on his skin faded. The gash on his shoulder turned into a scar. But Aaron could still see the war inside him. Every time she reached for his collar, his muscles tensed. Every time she left the house, he watched the door for hours, waiting. Every time she moved too quickly, he braced for impact. She tried everything. Long walks, treats, gentle reassurances. But nothing reached him. Because Bruno wasn't waiting for comfort. He was waiting for a command, a purpose. And then, one night, Aaron realized he had been trained for war, but what if he could be retrained for something else? The K-9 training facility sat on the outskirts of town. At first, Aaron wasn't sure if they would take him. "He's a rescue," she explained to the head trainer, a retired officer named Mark. "He has trauma. He's been through hell." Mark nodded, watching Bruno, who sat stiffly by Aaron's side, his eyes locked on the trainer. "He's disciplined," Mark observed. "Loyal." "He's waiting for something," Aaron said quietly. Mark crouched down, meeting Bruno's gaze. "You ever worked with a working line shepherd before?" Aaron shook her head. Mark smiled. They don't just want to work, they need to. The training began the next day, and for the first time in weeks, Bruno moved. Not out of fear, not out of desperation, but out of instinct. The first command, sit, was met with immediate obedience. The second, stay, was followed without hesitation. Then came the tracking drills, the search exercises, the agility courses. And with each task, something inside Bruno shifted. His eyes brightened, his muscles relaxed. His tail, stiff and unmoving for weeks, twitched ever so slightly. And Aaron finally understood. Bruno wasn't broken. He had just never been given a choice before. Now, he had one. And he was choosing to fight. Not for survival, not for fear, but for something greater. For Aaron. For himself. For a life that he had never known he could have. 1 month later, Aaron stood on the training field, watching as Bruno completed his final test. A simulated search and rescue drill. The trainers had hidden a volunteer deep in the woods. Bruno had been given a scent. And now, he was running. Fast, precise, unstoppable. Aaron's breath caught as she watched him move. This was not the same dog she had pulled from a cage. This was not the same dog who had flinched at every sound. This was something new. This was freedom. And when Bruno found the volunteer, when he barked, loud and strong, signaling his success, his tail wagged. A full, joyous, unrestrained wag. Aaron felt tears prick her eyes. Bruno wasn't waiting anymore. He was living. And for the first time, Aaron let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the fight really was over. But then, her phone rang. And everything shattered. Carter Hayes had escaped. The words sent ice through Aaron's veins. Bruno, who had been resting at her feet, lifted his head. He knew. She could see it in the way his ears twitched, in the way his muscles coiled beneath his thick fur. The war was not over. Not yet. And this time, they would be ready. Bruno's tail stopped wagging. He rose to his feet, body taut, eyes locked on the door. He had fought before. He had survived before. But this time, he would finish it. The news of Carter Hayes's escape spread like wildfire. Aaron barely had time to process it before her phone buzzed with another call, this time from the police. "We have officers patrolling your area," the officer assured her, his voice steady. "We don't believe Hayes will come after you, but given your involvement in the case, it's best to stay alert." Stay alert. As if she and Bruno had done anything else since the day they met. Aaron hung up, her fingers tightening around the phone. Across the room, Bruno sat motionless, his eyes locked on her. He had understood. Somehow, in that deep, wordless way of his, he had understood. The man who had hurt him, who had tried to erase him, was free. And Bruno wasn't going to wait for him to strike first. Neither was Aaron. She took a slow, steady breath and knelt beside him, pressing a hand into the thick fur at his neck. "We're not running," she whispered. "Not this time." Bruno didn't blink, didn't move. But his tail flicked just once, and Aaron knew. He was ready. The days crawled by. The police increased their presence in the neighborhood, but Aaron could feel the tension crackling in the air. She went about her life as best as she could, but her body was always on edge. Every shadow seemed darker. Every noise seemed louder. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Bruno had changed something inside her. He had taught her that fear wasn't an ending, it was something to be overcome. She had saved him once. And now, he had saved her too. One evening, a storm rolled in. The wind howled against the house, rattling the windows. Rain hammered the roof. Aaron stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing a plate, when Bruno's low growl rumbled through the room. She froze. He was by the window, his ears pricked forward, his body tense. Something was outside. Aaron turned off the faucet, her pulse thrumming against her ribs. She moved carefully, stepping up behind him and peering through the glass. Darkness, rain, and a shadow near the fence. Her stomach twisted, Bruno's growl deepened, and then the motion sensor light clicked on. A figure bolted. Erin's breath left her in a rush. She grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling over the screen as she dialed the police. "This is Erin Parker," she whispered. "He's here." She barely got the words out before Bruno moved. Like a shot, he lunged toward the back door, his body a streak of muscle and instinct. "Bruno, no!" But it was too late. The door slammed open, and he was gone. Rain soaked through Erin's clothes as she ran into the yard, her breath sharp and ragged. Bruno was already on the intruder's heels. Carter Hayes. Even in the dim light, Erin saw the man's face twist in panic. Bruno's snarl cut through the storm like a knife. Hayes turned, his feet slipping in the mud, and yanked something from his belt. A knife. Erin's heart stopped. "Bruno! Back!" she screamed. But Bruno wasn't backing down. He lunged, Hayes slashed. The world narrowed to a single moment. A heartbeat, a breath, the sound of rain hitting the earth. Bruno's body hit Hayes with the force of a battering ram. The knife went flying. Hayes hit the ground, hard, gasping for air. And then Bruno was on him, his teeth bared, his snarl vibrating through the night. Erin ran forward, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The man beneath Bruno was shaking, his hands raised in surrender. Bruno's teeth hovered just inches from his throat, waiting. Erin reached for him, her voice steady but firm. "Bruno, it's over." A pause, a long trembling breath. Bruno's ears twitched, and then he stepped back, slowly, deliberately, because this time it had been his choice, and that choice had saved them both. The police arrived within minutes. They dragged Hayes away, soaked and cursing, his eyes flicking to Bruno one last time. Erin stood there, shivering, watching the lights of the squad car disappear into the storm. Then she looked at Bruno. His fur was soaked. His ribs heaved with exhaustion. But when she reached for him, he leaned into her touch. And for the first time since the attack, she felt him relax. Bruno slept soundly that night. For the first time in a long time, there were no nightmares, no pacing, no waiting, just peace. And in the morning, when Erin woke, she found him stretched out in a patch of sunlight, his body loose, his tail flicking lazily against the floor. She smiled. And then she whispered, "We did it." Bruno lifted his head, his deep brown eyes soft. And then he wagged his tail. A slow, gentle movement. Not a nervous twitch, not a hesitant flick, but a true wag. Erin felt tears sting her eyes. Because for the first time, Bruno wasn't just surviving. He was home. And nothing, not cages, not fear, not even the past, was ever going to take that away again. Bruno's story didn't end with Carter Hayes' arrest. It didn't end with survival. It didn't even end with justice. Because Bruno's story wasn't just about what had been done to him. It was about what he had become. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way Erin had never known before. Bruno no longer watched the door with that heavy, restless tension. He no longer startled at sudden noises. He no longer waited for something to go wrong. Because, for the first time in his life, he believed that nothing would. The transformation was slow, but steady. At first, it was small things. Bruno sleeping deeper, his body finally relaxing when he stretched across the couch. The way his tail wagged. Not just in fleeting, uncertain flicks, but in full, happy sweeps. And then, one afternoon, Erin took him to the park. She had been hesitant at first. Too many people. Too many dogs. Too many unpredictable things. But Bruno had earned this. So she clipped on his leash, held her breath, and took him beyond the safety of their home. At first, He was cautious, his eyes sweeping the area. His ears flicked at every sound. But then a golden retriever ran past, tongue lolling, tail wagging, a ball bouncing between its paws. Bruno watched. Aaron saw the moment something inside him shifted, because for the first time, he wanted to play. It started with a hesitant step, then another, and then, before Aaron could even register what was happening, Bruno bolted. Not in fear, not in defense, but in joy. She had never seen him move like that before. Free, unburdened, happy. Her heart clenched as she watched him, his powerful legs carrying him across the grass, the wind rippling through his thick coat. And when he caught up to the retriever, when the other dog nudged the ball toward him, Bruno did something she never expected. He barked, not in warning, not in alarm, but in excitement. Aaron covered her mouth, a laugh bubbling up from her chest. Bruno wasn't just living anymore. He was thriving. Bruno became something greater than a survivor. He became a symbol. People from all over reached out, inspired by his story. Aaron received messages from veterans who had been through their own battles, who saw in Bruno their own fight to heal. Parents of rescue dogs who had been deemed too broken sent her photos of their pets, dogs who, like Bruno, had been given a second chance. Shelters began using his story to push for tougher laws against puppy mills and dog-fighting rings. And slowly, the world that had once tried to break him began to change because of him. Aaron had never expected any of it. She had only wanted to save one dog. But in the end, he had saved her. And so many others. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Aaron sat on the porch, Bruno beside her. The world was quiet, warm, peaceful. She ran a hand through his fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. "Do you know what you are, Bruno?" she murmured. He turned his head, pressing his muzzle into her palm. "You're proof that no one is ever too broken to be loved." Bruno blinked, tilting his head. And then, his tail wagged. A full, happy, content wag. And Aaron knew. Bruno's nightmare was over. For good. Final message to viewers. Bruno's story is just one of thousands. Right now, there are dogs suffering in silence, waiting, hoping, surviving. Waiting for someone to see them. Hoping for someone to fight for them. Surviving. Until someone chooses to save them. If Bruno's journey has touched you, consider making a difference. Adopt. Rescue. Speak out against cruelty. Because every dog deserves what Bruno found. Not just survival, not just freedom, but love. And the chance to live again.